Hello and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm Jane Ball, co-founder of Dialogue Associates along with Peter Garrett. To talk to people, it's best to use monologue. Dialogue is different. It's about talking and thinking with people. Through dialogue, we discover how interconnected we are and how we all contribute to the situation we are experiencing, whether or not we like it. Through what we call professional dialogue, we work with all sorts of organisations to enhance their health, effectiveness and prosperity. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. Throughout this series, we'll be hearing some of the experiences and unpacking some of the learnings from Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. The book, as I mentioned in the foreword, is not a how-to-do dialogue book, and neither is this podcast. We instead invite you to think, feel, and reflect on your own life as we explore some of Peter's lifetime of research and first-hand learning. Through that, you can discover a much deeper understanding of dialogue and its benefits to your own life and work. Over the course of 10 episodes, we're exploring parts of the book's 26 chapters. Towards the end of this episode, we'll hear a question from Robert Sarly, a man with 37 years' experience as an advisor to high net worth investors. Today, chapters 4, 5 and 6 are up for discussion. Into spirituality, two men about to meet, and a new kind of dialogue is born. In the first episode, we explored your early life in Africa and the UK and your travels between the adventures you had, and also your experiences of separation and interconnectedness. But here in chapter 4, we pick up the autobiographical thread of your story. You are still in South Africa, living in a mud rondavel, farming, with your wife and two children?
One child.
Still just one child at this point. And how old were you?
I am mid-20s.
Okay.
With a
You've done a lot.
wife, daughter, dog and two cats at that point.
Good. But this chapter is called Into Spirituality. So for some context, could you tell us a bit about how you stepped into spirituality?
Yeah, so although my the birth certificate for my daughter says I'm a farmer and so on, really the aim was to drop out. I wanted to have as remote an experience as I could. And we were not just on a farm, but on the slopes high up of a farm where we were in the wild and where we did walk every morning to a stream to swim and so on. What it had from that was a huge sense of interconnectedness and also that I belonged. I belonged where I was and felt comfortable with that. However, you can't actually drop out. The rest of the world's there. We were selling farm produce, milk and cheese and vegetables and so on. And in Cape Town, there was a guy called Peter Dowling who ran a herbal remedies shop. He was a naturopath, and we sold to him. Talking with him, he was involved in a spiritual movement, and his partner, not wife, but partner, Biddy, was as well. And it just looked kind of interesting what they were doing. So although we were comfortable with where we were, this looked like a slightly different resolution of the wild and the civilized.
So what was interesting about what they were doing? What did you see there?
They were bright, they were honest, they were engaging. They felt like they had some purpose.
What was the spirituality for you at that point? What did that mean?
Well, as typically happens in these kind of situations, this was a small US-originated spiritual group of a few thousand people, and got invited to a meeting. In the meeting, I could hear some real call to be upright and honest and genuine, with the overtone that was something beyond that, which was alive and present. Later, I discovered that the the originator of the movement, who'd since died, and the new guy, both believed they'd incarnated to save humanity. This is quite a deep claim, which I would have felt a bit dubious about at the time. But they also believed that everybody had come with some purpose in life. And I reckon I had a purpose in life. So it just kind of felt like it could be a way of understanding how to live in a good way in a civilized world rather than dropping out. The approach was based on community living. One of the ideas was that work is love made manifest. And I like working. And I like the idea that work would be a manifest form of love. So I was quite drawn to find out more. I like the people, and they invite us into their community home in Cape Town. And Jenny and I decided to go, which we did. I think Jenny wasn't unhappy to get back a little bit more into civilization, but didn't last long. So I'm not sure. You have a question, I can see.
Well, I was thinking, because one of the challenges for me personally, and I don't know what our listeners will think, but spirituality, as a word, conjures up all sorts of different ideas. And what is attractive in what you've just said is the idea that it's work, which has a material aspect to it, because often spirituality seems to be ungrounded. And so work is not ungrounded. It has purpose, it has outcome that is tangible and can be seen and can be meaningful to lots of people. So can you say more about how that work played out? Were there specific things that you did together as a community in that work?
Well, we weren't long in Cape Town when the group bought a farm. And the farm they bought, I think for very good reason, was right close to where we had been farming. So after a few months, we actually went back onto a farm. But rather than a mud rondavel, we had an old Cape Dutch building. It's a beautiful old building from back in the 1700s. And that's where my son was born. That we began with 6 of us, and the idea of the community was to invite people to come and have a living experience of working, behaving, living together in a good way, an honourable way. And gradually expanded until we had maybe 18 or 20 or whatever people living there. It had a equivalent of a religious service. There were readings of papers that originated from the senior guy and so on. But I tend to find my own way. I created what I called an art of living program. Like, how do you live well?
Okay, tell us more about that. I was going to ask you about that. I'm interested in so there's the spiritual aspect to this chapter, there's the community aspect, but tell us about the art of living.
So the art of living bit was like an educational program in support of what was happening with this spiritual community, but it had my own flavour to it. So in the wild, you can feel how everything is integrated. And I was saying nothing is happening by chance. I described seeing some smoke or a bird circling and, is it a bird of prey or is it a vulture? We'll tell you what's on the ground and so on. What interested me here was to try and get that feel to people who lived in a civilized world all the time. So I used to say, well, we're very deeply connected to the cosmos. For example, every day when the sun rises and the earth faces the sun, we all get up. When the earth no longer faces the sun, we all lie down. All over the planet, we do that. We get up and lie down every day. So we're pretty closely connected to the sun. And similarly to the moon, where we have the cycles, which are like very similar to menstrual cycles. We call it the earth, but it's more sea. Actually, majority of the surface is sea. But I know from my days of naturopathy, pure seawater can be used for transfusion rather than blood. We're very close, but when you come closer to the body and you look at the iris reflecting, every serious injury you have is reflected in your iris for the rest of your life. It's all connected. And you look at your hands or your feet, look at the feet, the imprint in the sand, you can see the whole body. Big toes, the head, the large part of the foot is the chest and the abdomen, the heel is lower down in the body. And if you massage people, you can see that. So I could get this whole sense of integration at a physical level, trying to connect affect people who hadn't been in the wild and wouldn't have a sense that they're part of a whole living, organic, cosmic process.
How well do you succeed with that?
With
people actually not just intellectually understanding, but themselves getting a feel of that interconnectedness that you had so strongly?
Well, people were affected by it. People changed their lives. People came and got involved. I'm thinking one guy was driving past in a car with his girlfriend. He stopped and stayed for years. First name was Cliff, if I remember well. But it did affect people, and I think part of it was I enjoyed the extemporaneous thinking. A bit like now, I'm clearly drawing on memory and doing that deliberately to pick up pieces in the book and try and draw attention to that. But I like thinking live about what's happening. And you can do that differently with a group of people than you can with one other person or on your own. You can think well on your own, but it takes a lot of attention. Somebody else you're stimulated. With a group, there's a kind of energy or substance you can draw on, which can really be very helpful in what I call live thinking or extemporaneous thinking.
One of the terms that you talk about in the book is this concept of pneumaplasm, which is a word that most people have probably never heard of, I expect. Could you say a little bit more about pneumaplasm? Because I think it's relevant here.
Yeah, there are two ways of coming at it, but I think I may have mentioned in the first episode that nothing happens by chance. What people call accidents aren't really accidents. I know from working in the oil and gas industry, if you have a look there, you do a root cause analysis after an explosion or whatever, it's not an accident. The information was there, but the information didn't flow. What I found with the group work I was able to do in the community, and I noticed it with my wife and daughter and breastfeeding and so on, what I found with the group was that the atmosphere changes a lot. You can have an atmosphere which is cautious or anxious or frightened or whatever, but you can get an atmosphere which is very conducive to being open and authentic and going a bit deeper with things. And that whole area, that atmosphere or whatever, in a room with a group, I'd call pneumaplasm. And pneuma is spirit, plasm is substance. So it's not physical substance, but it's an atmosphere you can pick up and feel when you walk into a room or whatever. What I noticed was working with that in a number of ways, and I could say more about how, that the quality of the pneumaplasm, the atmosphere, affects what people call accidents. Doesn't sound very likely, but I give an example. You've got your kids next door playing, and they start getting rowdy. Now, you can hear some noise, but you know what's going on, and as they get more and more loud, you know what's going to happen. Somebody's going to fall, somebody get broken, somebody will start crying or whatever, and should you intervene or not? The atmosphere isn't the right one for their own safety and enjoyment and so on. And I think that was the big thing I found in relation to the dialogue work, is that the atmosphere is generated by the way we behave, by the way we relate to each other, and affects the safety of the situation. So driving a car, you can drive in a way that affects people around you. I mean, obviously you give signals and things which help people know what's going on, but just the way in which you drive can start to affect. Noise in an aircraft, you can settle an aircraft by the way in which you sit in your seat, interestingly. And you should try it, or anybody listening should have a try. When there's a disturbance in an aircraft, see if you can settle that by the way you are present. And you can. So this whole, if I go further, the so-called accidents I started to realize are self-corrections. Systemically, they happen to get the thing back on keel. So maybe I'm not answering very well your question about pneumaplasm, but
I'll come back to it.
I did explore it with healing in particular, a form of attunement, which is no-touch healing, I got very involved in understanding the relationship between that atmosphere and the body. Had some really interesting stuff come up. Mm.
Can I ask you, you're encouraging people to try and affect the atmosphere on a plane. They may want to start with something easier. Maybe start with your kids when they're getting excited. And that would be an invitation to try something and firsthand learn.
Yeah.
But what did you learn about how to do that? What did you learn to do to settle an atmosphere or create the atmosphere that you wanted?
Well, if there is a disturbance, the disturbance is outside. So there's a disturbance next door from the kids, or a disturbance in the plane for the children that won't stop crying, or whatever it might be in the traffic. The question is, can you find that disturbance inside yourself? You wouldn't perceive it, notice it, if it weren't inside. So I take the sound from next door and feel disturbed in myself. That disturbance I have in myself, can I settle that disturbance? Not going next door and saying, calm down, but can I settle myself, center myself, so the disturbance is not disturbing me? I know the disturbance is there, but it's external. If I can settle myself, then I can start to see how to contribute to settle the disturbance outside. So initially, it's a matter of sitting still on that aircraft and being still, noticing the disturbance. My disturbance amplifies it, as does everybody else's. We all get worried about it. Settle down and allow others to settle down, and gradually you can settle the external. So the problem, the challenge is to do this internally, to begin within oneself and allow it to extend beyond. That's my experience with working with atmosphere. I'm
going to take, I don't know, maybe it's not a different direction, but about community. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the community was affected by these sort of practices. What did you learn about other people and groups of people through the process of, through your involvement and living with people in this community?
There were a few things. One, if you grow a community over some years, from 5 or 6 people up to 20 people or whatever, and later I grew larger communities, you're involved with people's lives. So meetings are a small part of it. But meetings are a significant part, and I led, facilitated, whatever you might call it, meetings a couple of times a week, year after year after year. Probably 8 years every week I was leading meetings. After a while, you get to understand what you need to do to get people involved. People's minds are wandering like they tend to in a church or whatever. You're not going to get anywhere. So how do you engage people, draw them in? How do you work thinking with people and drawing them into the experience? I learned a lot about that. What do you do when somebody objects or is resistant? At one meeting, I remember, somebody else was standing at the lectern talking, and there were about 40 of us in the room, and he suddenly swirled round and collapsed on the floor, unconscious. I thought, that was interesting, halfway through our meeting. So I got up and asked a couple of people, took him out, and I went behind the lectern and carried on the meeting. How could I carry on the meeting? Because I was concentrating on what he was saying, and I knew where it would go, and I could develop it, and we could move further. And it felt appropriate to not give distractive energy to a person who was unwell physically, but allow the group to provide a calm atmosphere for him to recover, which he did, and he was fine. He just fainted.
I know that you had some caution about writing about this part of your story.
Yes.
And the chapter of interspirituality. Can you say why that was? What was your caution?
Yeah, it'll probably come out now and further as we go, but I think it's a bit of a leap of faith to believe that an individual is here to save the world. I know there's that idea is in Christianity that, in this case, one man arrived for that purpose, but I've met several people who believe they incarnated in that way. That kind of leap of faith you can't quite test. You can't say, well, was he or wasn't he, or is he or isn't he? And what I realized was there was a deep conviction within this group to think together in the same way. I started to adopt the language of the group. You know the term ego, which is gives a kind of strength in an individual to do stuff. We found this word we-go. We-go is a collective ego. Well, there was a we-go in this group, which years later I started to look back on as really being more like a cult. I don't think it was a cult. The integrity of the leadership was far beyond that, and its purpose was beyond that. But it would be easy to look at it that way. And I had occasionally newspaper people turn up and interview me on that basis and so on. So I was inclined to leave it out of the book and think, why make myself vulnerable to being thought of as in some spiritual cult or religious cult or whatever. But I realized I learned too much. Yeah. I learned too much in that time, in those 7 or 8 years, that really played right into the dialogue work in a healthy way.
Yeah. I guess the opportunity that was created, or the turning point in your story that was created by being part of that community, was your meeting with David Bohm. Tell us a bit about.
So I could say the community I began in outside Cape Town, an hour out of Cape Town. I went to the US to look at the headquarters of this spiritual group, which was very impressive. You could get 400 people in one room there. Then I helped create a community in the UK and did something similar. There was a quite separate movement called the Human Unity Conference, and every year it was run by a different grouping, and this grouping I was involved with took on the running of it one year. And you could have whatever theme you liked as long as it related to human unity. So because I was leading one of the main communities in the group, I got to contribute to the theme, and the theme was integrity. So the idea was that the state of the world and integrity are quite closely related. So it was a call for integrity. And we decided to use Warwick University. We have a big meeting room. In the end, we had 625 people signed up and come to this conference. So that gave the freedom to contact anybody. And that was the kind of opening that took me beyond, I think. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of your book, this takes us into the next chapter. And I think the chapter is called Two Men About to Meet. And that being you and David Bohm. We've heard quite a lot about your story. Some people who are listening to this podcast will know who David Bohm is and may know an awful lot about him, but some may know nothing or little about him. Could you introduce us to David Bohm?
Well, I knew almost nothing about him when I met him. I'd been after people like Thor Heyerdahl. Do you know Thor Heyerdahl?
I have no idea who Thor Heyerdahl is.
Made papyrus rafts that sailed from North America across to the South America, across to the Polynesian, and Lawrence van der Post, who worked with the... Anyway, my colleague, Don Factor, he's no longer alive now, but he was Max Factor's son. Don and I were close friends. Don knew of a guy called Rupert Sheldrake, morphic fields, which are quite closely related to pneumaplasm. So I thought, let's get him on the conference. We approaching Rupert Sheldrake. David Bohm's a far bigger man. I don't know who he is, but if he is, let's get him. So Don arranged a meeting. He turned out to be at Birkbeck College in London, and off we went to Birkbeck College to go and meet him. And on the way, Don told me he's just published a book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. Okay, sounds... if he's a big man, let's get him on the conference. So my interest was to try and...
The big name.
Well, 625 people, there's a lot, we've got to get a lot of people at this conference so we don't go broke. Do you want background on David? Do you want to know about meeting him?
I think a little bit about him.
Okay, so he was born in the US. Father ran a furniture company. Depression. He believed that science could probably save the economy, society. People were hungry. There was a tough time. So he went into studying physics and proved to be very good at it. Theoretical physicist. He, in the end, worked with all the luminaries, by which I mean he worked closely with Albert Einstein. He wrote textbooks on Bohr's quantum theory and so on. He's right. And he was involved in the group that in the end made the atomic bomb which ended the Second World War, dropped in Japan. Meeting him, he was the best thinker I'd ever come across, but he was very accomplished in his field, although I don't think many people had heard about him. He got caught up in McCarthy era, where people were asked to testify against colleagues, which he refused to do, took the Fifth Amendment. So then they charged him so they could get him to talk and found him innocent, but he lost his job. In the end, he went to Sao Paulo in Brazil for a couple of years. Then he went to Israel, Wiseman's Institute, and then over to the UK to London and gone to Birkbeck College and worked from there. But he was shunned by quite a few in the States, but kept working steadily.
Mm-hmm. He dealt with quite a big kind of social dynamic in his life, but yet his focus was really the science.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A snippet is when he was arrested and taken to court to be charged himself. What he noted afterwards was the policeman who drove him there was a very interesting man. They had a very good conversation, and he understood some of the basics of theoretical physics in a way that other people didn't. Yet he was going to be charged and lost his job and everything. So what he considered important was deeper understanding, and that was clear with him. When I say he worked with Einstein, I mean, Einstein said that the mantle of his work passed on to David Bohm. So it wasn't just that he was a student. They had a huge problem, you see. Einstein had come up with relativity, which is about very large objects and relates to the speed of light and so on. Quantum theory, rather than continuous fields, with continuous energy, and that's about very small particles, so small we can't see them. But the mathematics, they couldn't reconcile the mathematics of quantum theory and the mathematics of relativity. In the end, they agreed it can't be reconciled, and David was, it can. There's only one universe. There must be the same reality all the way. So something's gone wrong, but not only did they not resolve it, the groups of scientists wouldn't talk to each other. He describes being in a kind of cocktail party situation, and Einstein and all people go one end, and Niels Bohr and all his people go the other end, and they don't talk to each other. They damaged the development of theoretical physics by not being able to think with each other. So he was still concerned about the well-being of society, as he had been, and thinking, how are we going to deal with this? And that was what he was trying to resolve when I met him. I was making good headway on it.
Yeah. So you met him. I want to know more about his science that reconciled those two, but presumably this is what he talked about at the Human Unity Conference in his... I guess your theme was the theme was integrity.
Yeah, well, what happened, Don and I went to Birkbeck, very ordinary, more like a high school than a university, I thought, with a chalkboard that he wrote on and so on. And, but what interested me when we arrived was no formalities, no, well, how are you, where have you come from, have you had a good journey, would you like a cup of tea? Just, yes, where have you come? This is where we come. Well, that's interesting. But he was just straight into the deep end. What we took as integrity, meaning having a wholesome and upright behavior, which was part of the spiritual community, he took integrity at a level of everything being integrated, which was what he was trying to resolve in his physics. And of course, that took me right back into the wild, where I had that experience and I knew what he was trying to do. So we talked, and he talked, basically said, you have parts and you have fragments. Parts work together. In the human body, you've got lungs and hearts and liver. They all work together. They all are affected by each other. You start running, your heart beats faster and more air and so on. He said, then you have fragments. Fragments are broken apart. They no longer work together. And what we seem to have in human consciousness is fragmentation. I guess the simplest example was Einstein and Bohr. They no longer were parts of the same community of theoretical physics. They're broken apart. And the more that breaks up socially and so on, and this fragmentation in consciousness, where people don't sense participating in the whole, then starts to take form around one and starts to become apparent in the way that people make decisions about what they do in a material sense. So we end up then with fragmentation around us and give all our attention to that, just like the kids next door making a noise. We're trying to solve all these external problems. But somehow, and he was proposing, there is a way of thinking about how to address fragmentation in human consciousness. That's what attracted me, and there's a reason why he felt there was some way forward. Yeah.
It sounds like at this juncture for you, so we go back into your story from David Bohm's thinking, that there is some theory, some thinking and theory here that connects very strongly with the first-hand experiences that you'd had.
Absolutely.
Right from childhood, right from chapter 1.
First-hand experience was the common feature, but rather than being in the bush with boulders and rocks and birds and snakes or whatever, this was intellectual. It was an intellectual terrain for first-hand learning. I had the inkling then that the spiritual community was based on some fixed ideas which weren't open to inquiry. Whereas I felt with talking with David Bohm, we could inquire about pretty well anything. But I still just wanted to get him to the conference, and he didn't agree before we printed out our materials.
No, I may be jumping in terms of your relationship with David Bohm. I may be jumping about a bit in terms of the chronology, but still, his ideas about fragmentation, parts, wholeness, did that come more from his maths, essentially, as a theoretical physicist, compared to yours being from experience?
I believe there's a deeper reason that I don't hear much about, but he was trying to resolve two approaches to physics, which are the big shifts in theoretical physics of the last century. And what he felt was that the way they were thinking, what you'd call the ontology, the way they were thinking about reality, was a problem. They had different ontologies. By ontology, I mean, how is it that things are? What he found was, if you take a different ontology, you have the seeds of how to reconcile the two approaches. And this ontology is one that everything is continually unfolding. He later wrote a book called, it's The Undivided Universe, that is the title. If you take an unfolding approach, you can reconcile the two. After he died, the work he did with Basil Hiley published and did that. But at this point, he was still working with it. And this ontology that everything is unfolding is a bit like a Buddhist ontology. In Buddhism, the idea is not one life, but you have to work well with your life and what develops. And I felt things unfolding in my own life. I could see some relationship with that process of unfoldment. So the ontology of continual unfoldment and enfoldment, he called it, leads back to the idea there's an implicate order and things unfold from that and enfolded back into it. And that kind of thinking leads to everything being integrated. That's what he was working with in that area. Question was, where was it in the world around? Why don't we see everything unfolding? Why aren't you and me unfolding? Well, we are. And if we do another recording in 20 years' time, well, it'll be apparent we've unfolded a bit more. And we will be enfolded back into the earth, no doubt, like everybody else. So we are, but he couldn't see it enough, and that's what led to the insight of fragmentation.
Yeah. So he came to speak at the Human Unity Conference, and there did he use the metaphor of the acorn and the oak tree to describe
How did you know that?
I may have heard this story once or twice. But it's important, I think, not only because of what I love about it, and you'll explain it, but not only does it bring out this thinking about unfoldment and enfoldment, but in a simple way, in a metaphor that I think is easily understandable.
So he did agree to come to the Human Unity Conference. It ran over 3 full days. There were 40 or 50 speakers in every field. He had a slot for about 45 minutes before lunch on the second day, I think it was. So I drove to his home in London and drove him and his wife, Sarly Bohm, out to the centre. We went. He went on stage. The first meeting I had with him in Birkbeck College, Don Factor, me and him, was absolutely engrossing and immediately in the deep end, and I lost sense of time completely. We found afterwards we had a half-hour appointment. We were an hour and a quarter. We missed our train. We had to catch another one. When he appeared in the Human Unity Conference, hundreds and hundreds of people in bank seating, he was exactly the same. He could have just been talking to me. I was astounded. He started to talk and said, well, we have this problem in the world and society. We have wholeness and parts. And he said, what I propose is an ontology of continual unfoldment and enfoldment. So an example would be an acorn and an oak tree. So an acorn is better thought of as being part of the environment. So an acorn doesn't get bigger and bigger to become an oak tree. It's the environment unfolds through the acorn. The earth, the moisture, so on, go through the acorn, which forms a seed, which forms a sprout and grows. But how it happens is that the acorn has DNA in it. That DNA informs how the environment unfolds through the acorn to become an oak tree. And then that oak tree produces more acorns. Typically, the acorns fall to the ground and they in turn form more oak trees. That's very different from our human buildings we create that are continually falling apart. There's a continual unfoldment and enfoldment, and that was his example of how to think about it.
So in that case, I think this moves us into the next chapter, which is called A New Kind of Dialogue is Born.
All right.
So at this point, you invited David to meet again.
I drove him home and said, man, that was pretty good. I was astounded. If you call it the pneumaplasm in the room, the intensity was amazing. I don't think people understood what he was saying. I'm going to read it later, but they could feel the significance of it. I could. So he said, no, having 45 minutes with 625 people isn't doing this justice. I'll gather a group of friends and let's have a weekend and really go into what you're doing. And he said, fine. At first meeting, he didn't say yes or no, but this time he said, I'd like to do that. And so that's what we did. I hired a whole hotel just near my home in Gloucestershire and invited people to come. I didn't advertise it. I invited people I knew and welcomed them, inviting other people they knew. I thought we can't get through this whole process of large group of strangers working out who everybody is. We need people who have some sense of the value of what David Bohm had been bringing into the room and where we might go with it. And the aim was to understand his work.
So what happened? You got people in the room. How were they? Was it a lecture theatre? Was it again like another lecture? How did you set things up for this occasion?
Well, I'll just say half the people in the room were related to the spiritual community. Roughly half were related to sciences in different ways and were academics. So there was that kind of mix in the room. And upstairs we had a room which was a bit awkward, a bit of a long room. He was at one end and sat on a chair and had a paper that he'd brought and read. It did relate to wholeness and parts, but it was a bit obscure. And people arrived and were very excited to be, man, this is the man who knows how the cosmos works. And to hear him read a paper not very well was... You
were taking the temperature or feeling the pneumaplasm, presumably, you knew.
Fortunately, he didn't faint on the floor and didn't get up and take over. But what I did do was to say, look, I think what would help us, would everybody write down a question they have as a result of this evening and us all gathering? Now, I'll gather them up and we'll look at them, and then tomorrow we'll kick off looking at some of these questions. And that kind of brought people back, rather than thinking about what's going on in the room, to themselves and to think, what do I need to know? And also it informed later when I gave them all to David, it informed him of what was in the room, so he knew what he was talking into. He had had quite a bit of experience with a man called Krishnamurti, and we can talk about that on another occasion, but he was used to giving academic lectures, and that's what he did, and clearly something else was required.
Something happened, though, in that room of people, because that, as you say, it's a new kind of dialogue is born. What happened? Because the questions that people put forward could just get question and answer and more lectures, but answering people's questions. But something else happened. Can you take us into that?
Well, I realised we had to shift things, so I got hotel staff and built a raised platform. It was about maybe a foot or two higher, carpeted it, so he was on there with a chair and a table, got the lighting changed. You need good lighting to do this well. And so we rearranged the room so that it was semicircular rather than him being at the far end and everybody being closer to him being raised up. I met him in the morning, showed him the questions, and he was like, how are we going to answer these? And said, well, maybe we don't have to. And then he was just very endearing, came back, he was nervous. Why would he be nervous with 40 people but not with 600? Because he knew something more was required. And he said, well, it's good to be elevated and illuminated. He had a pleasant way of talking, and I've looked at your questions and thank you for taking the time to write them. I appreciate you doing that. And I don't know how to answer them all, but maybe if we take one or two of them, think about them, we could learn how to answer them together. And that beginning didn't deny what he brought, but it did open it for others to be able to join in the thinking in a delightful way. So we got off on the second day to a very different start from the Friday evening before.
How did people participate in that? How easy was it for them to, they're in front of this great man, he's saying, well, what do you all think?
He didn't really say, what do you all think?
Yeah.
He started to think and thought live. So he wasn't going back to what he already knew, but he was pursuing, perhaps the question is, well, maybe a question of identity. So he'd start thinking about identity and about his own identity and the group identity and how does identity change and what's it made up of and so on. And then I'd be thinking, well, I've had some amazing conversations about identity. I think of one with my daughter, which was really significant for me. And then out of the group would kind of percolate a comment and say, well, of course, identity is partly your own and partly your reputation, and add to it and think. And gradually we started to think a bit together, and he still had 2 more papers to come, but he was starting to realize this was quite interesting. And because of the relationships between the people, there was a good atmosphere. People really wanted to think and learn. And as we went, he started to realize, actually, this is more important, this thinking together, than me putting in more knowledge and more insights. And so he did read the second paper, but we had a long break after lunch. People could walk until, in the Cotswolds, so we had tea and scones and so on in the afternoon, but then late afternoon, talk again, but people were thinking. And gradually, in the end, he abandoned the third paper, or most of it. And we were now aware that there was a way in which the group could think together without preconception, to start to understand what was happening in the group in the moment. And when you get on the edge of first-hand thinking, it's really interesting, like what's happening right now. Memories are coming up. I can notice memories coming up and what's happening here and so on. And it was just a very engaging. Again, I don't think everybody knew what was happening, but by the end, we felt we had entered a kind of dialogue that we hadn't experienced before. The equivalent in the spiritual community was led by particular beliefs and tenets. The academic lectures were led by previous thinking. The work he'd done with Krishnamurti was led in a particular way, but this was open and emerging in its own right. And we knew something important was happening.
And the word dialogue you used for the first time to have a very particular meaning as a result of that weekend.
Yeah, David had some theoretical conversations about this. He had a good colleague called Patrick Demare, and Patrick Demare was the one who initially advocated the idea of dialogue. And he thought of dialogue as a free flow of meaning, but he hadn't really had the experience in anything like this way. So as it emerged here, this is where we first started to use the term dialogue. We recorded it with people's knowledge, and Don edited it. I'm more of a doer. I set up a publishing company and I published the book, Unfolding Meaning, a weekend of dialogue with David Bohm, and put the names of all the participants in the book and so on. And that was the birth of a new kind of dialogue.
Good. And so as well as your book, A New Kind of Dialogue, people can still purchase that book to read the transcript of everything that was said.
You could, if you could get back into that world to see it. It is interesting, certainly historically, but there's a little more writing we did after that, which was more instrumental in developing the dialogue work.
Which we'll come to.
But why that book is important is when we got ready for publication, David and I sat down and wrote a little one-page what happened. And, of course, what happened was initially people had fixed ideas and they were defending them and so on, and gradually realized there was something else happening, that there's a flow of meaning which everyone can participate in, which was the dialogue, and we stated that beginning. So that's the piece to look at in that original publication.
Yeah. That takes us to the end of that chapter, I think, and we'll pick up more in the next episode on the evolution of this practice. But in each episode, we invite people from around the world to join us and pose a question.
Right.
And today we have a question from Robert Sarly, as I mentioned in my introduction.
Do we understand ourselves principally to be acorns, trees, or squirrels?
Robert is clearly referring to this same metaphor to explain the unfoldment from the implicate into explicate form and back into the implicate. He's using the analogy of the acorn and the oak tree. He's bringing in squirrels, I think, because squirrels often bury acorns. They bury them for food store. So I think he's bringing in the squirrel to add colour and so on. But the essence of the metaphor is one of continuous unfoldment and enfoldment. And the interesting thing about his question is, if we think of ourselves as discrete, like an acorn separate and a tree separate from the environment, we miss the unfoldment in our own experience, in our own lives. If you think of the tree as being part of the environment and the environment unfolding into the form of a tree, which is a higher order and so on, you start to see in your own life there are things which are beginning. There are things, seeds may come out of hearing this podcast or talking with someone where you think that's worth thinking about. If you give attention to it, it'll grow. There's an art to noticing what's emerging in my experience, in my life, in the environment around me, and going with that in a way that enables it to become, in this metaphor, an oak tree. And of course, there's a way of understanding that some things are not only oak trees, but aged oak trees, and their time has come to start to dissolve back into the earth. So there are some things that need to be let go of, that need to die for the health of what happens next. So am I an acorn or an oak tree? Well, parts of my experience are very acorn-like and have a lot of growth to come. Part of it, because of my age, makes me more of an older oak tree who will no doubt move on in time. And I quite like the addition of the squirrel, which doesn't change the metaphor, but it adds the local colour of chance that is always there and important, and that this is not a precise art, it's a process more than things and objects. So thank you, Robert, for asking that question. It's enjoyable to think about.
I also think, is there something in Robert's question relating the metaphor to us as humans, and how, like the acorn takes in the moisture that moves through it and the nutrients from the soil, and as it comes through into the light, the sunshine, how well do we take on the environment around us? And really your whole book, and what we're inviting our listeners to do by listening to this podcast, is to think about what's in their environment, what has been in the past and is in their environment now, and what they can learn, how they can take that on in a way that nurtures and helps them grow. So I hear as well a metaphor about first-hand learning and development. And
of course, Robert advised people on wealth for much of his career. And people who have wealth, don't that unfold and generate and grow or not? You think of the biblical story of burying the talents. Buried talents don't grow. How do you contribute what you have to the good of the whole, to society and those around you, is part of that kind of guidance. So, and just my last comment is, the book that was published posthumously is called An Ontological Interpretation of Quantum Theory. The ontology being the unfoldment of the implicate order to explicate and back. In the last chapter of that book, which has mathematics and descriptions I'm unable to understand, guess what comes up as a metaphor? The acorn and the oak tree. So it is a great image for what we're talking about, and my experience of how things are generated if you work firsthand.
Lovely. Thank you. Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Ball, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Check out the show notes for extra information and links. Join us next time as we discuss chapters 7 and 8 of A New Kind of Dialogue, where dialogue itself as a concept and practice truly becomes a fundamental part of Peter's life.